Peter Martyr de Angleria, remember him, the gossip that just loved everything about the indigenous people? He was very good friends with Colon, from what we understand, and he would write about everything he heard about in terms of the indigenous population in the West Indies. He actually wrote about this incident, and he said the following. He said that a woman then appeared with the other Indians, and this woman, it was seen that they respected her probably as their queen. It doesn't specifically say where she appeared at. We assume that it was on the coastline. She wasn't alone. She came with her son. And Pedro de Angleria writes, he was a fierce and robust young man with a ferocious look and the appearance of a lion. From what I understood, Colon had sent several boats to try to capture this indigenous guide that he needed. So the Caribs who had attacked hadn't just attacked a small boat. There were several Spanish boats. These were smaller boats, not the bigger one where Colon was. So the indigenous people that had been dumped in the water and continued to shoot had actually managed to hit their marks, pierced a lot of their shields, so a lot of the Spanish were wounded. And when this woman, who appeared to be their queen, and her son appeared, it seemed like they were ready to just finish whoever was left alive. It's described that one stroke after the other, they just kept on shooting. But this was tiresome, and both the indigenous people and the Spanish became exhausted in the battle. Several of the indigenous people were also wounded, and the queen's son was wounded twice. In the end, the Spanish were able to capture them. And Pedro de Angleria says, the exhausted survivors were taken prisoners, and even after being taken on board of the admiral's ship, the natives did not lose their fierceness and ferocious looks, not unlike African lions once they feel trapped. Colon finally was needing the people that had the Taino population completely terrified. And by meeting them, he came to understand why they were so afraid. They were not only ferocious, but they also painted themselves in an extremely terrifying way. It was said that they painted themselves in a way that they looked almost cat-like. Pedro de Angleria notes that the Caribs would travel thousands of miles to capture their victims. It was the Caribs that brought this tension and this fear to the Caribbean islands. Pedro de Angleria compares the Caribs with the Tainos and says, but I feel that our natives of Española are happier than they. More so were they converted to the true religion, because naked, without burdens, limits, or death-inducing currency, living in a golden age, free, without fraudulent judges, books, and content in their natural state, they live with no worries about the future. And he says about the Caribs that they are troubled by the desire to rule and waste each other away with wars. So this was the contrast from where this young girl who was captured in this battle and the Tainos that the Spanish had already met. Columbus's best friend, Michel de Cuneo, he was also of Genoa, Italy, and he accompanied Colon on the second trip. He was intrigued by the Caribs' practices. He made a lot of notes about them and their culture. He also wrote, they have flat heads and the face tattooed, of short stature. As a rule, they have a very little beard and very well-shaped legs and are thick of skin. The women have their breasts quite round and firm and well-shaped. He also described how they groomed themselves. They would shave all the hair off their bodies, if whatever hair they had left, with sharpened canes, and then the hair from their nose, they would pluck them out with their fingers. He also didn't like the snakes, lizards, and spiders that they ate. And he also saw how they dealt with mosquitoes. All of us who have been in DR, we all know that mosquitoes are a problem. At least when I was younger, they were a big problem. Now, I think not so much. But he describes that they would cover their bodies with a dye to ward off the extremely annoying mosquitoes. He also said that they weren't very lustful, that they didn't engage in sexual activity a lot. But he also said that mostly, and this is his wording, according to what we have seen in all the islands where we have been, both the Indians, that is the Taino, and the Caribs are largely sodomites. Not knowing, I believe, whether they're acting right or wrong. Michel de Cuneo was also at this battle, and he recorded how the Spanish brutally dealt with the indigenous people on the canoe. He was actually present, and so he writes, one Carib was wounded by a spear in such a way that we thought he was dead. But instantly, we saw him swim. So they went to grab him, and they caught him and struggled to bring him back to the ship. But he kept fighting, even though he was wounded. What did they end up doing? He writes, we grappled with him to bring him back to the ship, where we cut off his head with an axe.